For nearly a century, one of the most haunting mysteries in history lay buried beneath the frozen soil of Russia. The fate of the Romanovs, the last imperial family, was shrouded in silence, speculation, and unanswered questions. For decades, no one truly knew what had happened on that fateful night in 1918. Only rumors, scattered letters, and forgotten bones whispered the tale. And then science stepped in. Modern DNA analysis unearthed secrets once thought lost forever. What researchers discovered didn't just solve a royal disappearance. It rewrote the final chapter of the Russian Empire itself. Suddenly, long-lost pieces, bones, documents, diaries, came together, painting a picture more complex, chilling, and human than anyone could have imagined. Because the tragedy of the Romanovs wasn't just about death. It was about power, fear, faith, and fate. And, like every great tragedy, it carried an air of romance and mystery that continued to captivate the world even 100 years later. But what truly happened on that cold July night of 1918, when the echoes of gunfire filled the dark basement in Ekaterinburg? Who gave the order? Who survived? And what did the DNA reveal about the secrets the empire tried to bury? Get ready, because what you're about to hear forever changed the way we see Russia's past. And before we continue down this path between royalty and ruin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss the next stories that uncover the buried truths of history. It was a small, dim room lit by a single lamp when the last imperial family of Russia found themselves huddled inside. Figures who had once moved through gilded corridors, now reduced to cramped quarters. Tsar Nicholas II held a photograph like a talisman of a life that felt already distant. Beside him, Tsarina Alexandra tried to steady the faces of her daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, while the thin frame of the heir Alexei betrayed his fragility. Hemophilia had taken away the robust constitution expected of a prince. Outside those walls, Russia convulsed. Inside, they waited, uncertain of the fate that approached. More than a year of revolution had torn the empire's old structures apart. The Tsar and his family, once symbols of imperial continuity, had become targets of popular fury. The Bolsheviks, the new keepers of fate, had taken them to a house in Ekaterinburg with a bland administrative name, the House of Special Purpose. The label sounded official, but behind it lay a darker reality, a place where the new power would settle what to do with the relics of the old world. That night, an order came down. The family must descend into the cellar for their protection. It was a phrase made to soothe. Nicholas carried Alexei, the boy's gait often unsteady, the small body a weight for his father, while Alexandra followed, every step marked by maternal worry and the strangling sense of confinement. For faithful attendants stayed by their side: Dr. Yevgeny Botkin, Anna Demidova, Ivan Karadinov, and Alexei Trupp. Ordinary names in an extraordinary moment. Ordinary people who chose to remain with their charges. They believed the cellar would bring safety. But once the door closed and the murky light lengthened, the scene shifted. More guards entered, weapons revealed. Someone read aloud from a newspaper. Words that presaged condemnation. What followed was horrific. Gunfire erupted. In the narrow, damp descent of that cellar, 11 people were killed. The event itself would be so shocking that, for decades, its precise truth would be obscured. But that was only the first layer of the story. The greater question loomed. After the shooting, what becomes of the bodies? How do you make evidence disappear? The Bolsheviks faced a cruel political logistics problem. 11 corpses were undeniable proof of a shocking murder. If such proof became public, the result could be fury and broader conflict. So they intended not just to kill, they intended to erase. A truck drove them deep into the forest. First, they considered dumping the bodies in the abandoned Four Brothers mine, an ugly plan that looked promising until they realized it wasn't deep enough. Then came more desperate measures: acid to corrode the remains, fire to destroy the traces. Yet acid and fire have limits. Burning 11 bodies to ash is a task beyond quick improvisation, especially in the cold hours before dawn. In the end, they chose to split the bodies. 9 were buried together in a large pit, while two, the smallest, the two children, were buried separately some 70 meters away. The graves were camouflaged, the surface smoothed, and a lie planted back in town. The family had been moved to safety. For years, that lie held. But secrets of such scale are hard to keep forever. Some of the men who had carried out the burial could not entirely silence their consciences. They left marks, maps, notes, private recollections, kept secret by fear of the Soviet state. Decades later, a man named Alexander Avdenin, trained as a geologist, but driven by a historian's curiosity, decided not to accept the rumor-riddled accounts as the final word. He spoke with elders who still remembered the events of 1918, studied maps, and pursued small clues across the forest. In 1976, he found the first grave site, a shallow pit containing 9 skeletons. Knowing the danger of speaking out in the Soviet era, Avdenin kept the discovery close. He confided only in a few friends, including a filmmaker, and visited the site covertly over the next 15 years, photographing and documenting proof in whispers. When the Soviet Union cracked open in the early 1990s, Avdenin and his colleagues felt the moment had come. In 1991, officials were escorted to the place, and with careful forensic techniques, the pit was excavated. 9 skeletons, just as Avdenin had said. But the remains alone did not answer all questions. The number and age distribution suggested the presence of Tsar Nicholas, Tsarina Alexandra, 3 daughters and 4 servants, but 2 children were missing. The enigma remained. That was when DNA became the detective's most important tool. Genetic material can survive when other indicators of identity do not. In the decades since 1918, science had developed methods to read small fragments of genetic code from bones and teeth, to amplify them, and to compare them to living relatives. Researchers compared the mitochondrial DNA of the remains to those of known relatives. Prince Philip, for example, shared maternal lineage with Alexandra. Other living relatives could serve as reference points. The genetic signals matched. Rare patterns, such as heteroplasmy found in Nicholas's mitochondrial DNA, matched across samples in a way that confirmed identities. Yet the missing children still pose questions. The myth of Anastasia's escape had lodged itself into popular imagination. Countless imposters and hopeful claimants declared they were survivors. But science persisted, and the search continued. Amateur researchers and treasure hunters scoured the forest for years. But the breakthrough came in 2007 when 3 amateur historians, Sergei Plotnikov, Alexander Avdenin, and Galina Gerasimova, unearthed a second, smaller burial about 70 meters from the first. They found 44 tiny fragments of bone and teeth, badly degraded and damaged by acids and fire. Even in that condition, there were clues. Silver dental fillings, a sign of wealth and medical care pointing to noble status. The challenge for geneticists was monumental. Extract DNA from charred, corroded particles. Amplify mini-traces using PCR. Assemble family relationships from fractured code. Laboratories in the United States and Austria took up the task, treating the fragments like a shredded manuscript to be painstakingly reassembled. The result astonished the scientific community. The DNA matches showed that the fragments belonged to the 2 missing children, Alexei and 1 daughter, Maria. The 2 graves taken together accounted for every member of the Romanov family and the 4 loyal servants who died with them. This scientific closure silenced many speculative narratives. The fairy tale notion that Anastasia had somehow survived lost its last serious footing. The empirical conclusion was simple and cruel. No surviving heirs remained. But the implications were broader than the end of a rumor. For Russia, the identification allowed a measure of official recognition, a way to reckon with a violent chapter. For historians and genealogists, the DNA profiles served as irrefutable anchors in a story long distorted by rumor. When the remains were finally thoroughly analyzed and reinterred with due ceremony, there was a simultaneous sense of resolution and sorrow. The church, the nation, and the scientific community each framed the discovery in different ways, as martyrdom, as historical truth, as the end of a mystery. In 2000, The Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas II and his family, a move given extra weight by the later genetic confirmations. The Romanov story is, among other things, a parable about how science and patience can resolve questions the politics of an era sought to obscure. For 70 years the forest held its secret not because nature conspires to hide guilt, but because fear and power kept mouths shut. Only technology matured enough and political conditions shifted enough for the truth to reemerge. Bones do not lie. They tell what words were once meant to hide. And yet, after identification, questions persist. Why was the decision taken to kill? What did it mean for a revolutionary movement to erase those it had vanquished so completely? How does justice confront such acts decades later? These are not questions answered by DNA. They are questions of human responsibility, of narrative, and of memory. In the end, the Romanov case illustrates how tragedy and revelation can be intertwined. It shows the limits of political power to control narrative forever, and the limits of myth to survive the scrutiny of modern science. The family's final chapter was tragic and brutal, and the patient work of uncovering what happened became, paradoxically, a way to close a wound that had festered for generations. The forest kept its secret for 70 years. In the end, under careful hands and with the patient labor of science, it gave back what it had hidden. For scientists, the Romanov case became a landmark, a clear example of how DNA analysis can turn old doubts into concrete answers, and how those techniques evolved to identify historical remains worldwide. The bone fragments exhumed near Ekaterinburg in 1991 could only be named once forensic genetics had advanced. Studies in the 1990s linked those remains to Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, and several members of their household, enabling a state funeral in 1998 at the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Years later, the 2007 find additional remains from the same area, and the DNA work that followed closed crucial gaps. They confirmed that the heir, Alexei, and one daughter were part of that tragic story. Those confirmations were possible because earlier samples were preserved and genetic methods had matured. The Romanov story teaches two practical, powerful lessons. First, genetic technology is more than a lab tool. It's a translator of the past that can return names and stories to light. Second, careful evidence preservation makes the difference between an eternal mystery and a solvable case. Without the samples kept after the first exhumations, many of these links could never have been proven. Today, the genetics behind the Romanovs is studied by museum curators, archaeology departments, and forensic labs as a high-impact case study, a reminder that science and memory move together. Which other historical mysteries do you think DNA could finally solve? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring where science meets the past, there's another video waiting for you.